I'll be starting us off today with a look at the new homes we're producing across our county to try to meet our county's housing needs. And then the rest of our policy team will share about the program cities are working on to try to increase the number of new homes, improve fair housing and access to opportunity for lower income residents, and protect tenants from displacement and homelessness. There is a limit to the time that we have today and so much to share. So stay tuned for our newsletters in the coming months as we share more analysis of this data with you. So what is the housing element? Every 8 years, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, or RHNA process, is used to assign each city and county in California their fair share of the region's new housing units to make room for future growth and to ease our housing crisis to meet the needs of residents that are already here in our communities. This process requires all local jurisdictions to create an 8-year plan known as a housing element to meet the housing needs of their residents at all income levels. This includes not only building more housing, but also protecting vulnerable residents from displacement, addressing disparities in housing access, and preserving our existing housing. The current RHNA cycle, the state sixth, covers the period from 2023 to 2031. So we're close to the middle of it, just shy of the center. All of the jurisdictions in Santa Clara County had their housing elements certified by the state in 2023 and 2024, although they all missed the January 31st, 2023 deadline. But now the hard work is underway as local jurisdictions are implementing the programs in their 8-year work plans. Housing elements lay the foundation and create the conditions for thousands of new homes to be built. But how feasible and successful these plans are depends on how cities implement their plans and on the involvement of housing elements like you, or housing advocates like you. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the moment that we're in, which is a really difficult one in so many ways. So if you want to curl up and hide your head under a blanket, you're not alone. We're all living in an environment with a lot of uncertainty. In the world of housing, we're facing high and escalating costs, both to build and to operate housing. Not enough funding identified yet for all the affordable homes that we need. Construction workforce shortages and rising income inequality that creates a lot of pressure on people who don't make enough money to compete in our high-cost housing market. And in this moment of real duress, people need a safe, stable, and dignified home they can afford now more than ever. It'll take everyone in our community, including each of you, to make sure that we all come through this together. We'll share some concrete actionable steps you can take to help later in this program. We know we need homes for people at all income levels, and that's why the RHNA gets specific about assigning targets to cities by income level. I want to pause for a moment and look at what we're actually talking about when we talk about income levels. Income levels are a percentage of the area's median income, or AMI. These numbers are established annually by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and adjusted for each county by California's Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. Santa Clara County has one of the highest median incomes in the state and the nation, with the median income for a family of 4 now just above $205,000. You can see in the chart on the right that our median income for a family of 4 continues to go up. It moves up every single year. It's increased almost $64,000 just since 2020. So this is a function of our extreme income inequality, with folks at the upper end of the spectrum dragging that number up. It certainly does not mean that folks at the lower end of the income spectrum have gotten a $64,000 raise over the last 6 years. You can see here that in Santa Clara County, almost as many people have incomes that are at the lower end of the spectrum as incomes that are high. So nearly half of our population is living at low income. And these folks that really struggle to compete in our high-cost housing market. SB at Home's work is focused on meeting the housing needs of people in those lower income categories. It's really important that when we talk about RHNA progress, we're not reducing that progress to a single number representing all the housing units built in a jurisdiction, because that leaves out the information we need about who we are and who we aren't building for. We need to break it out by income level to understand the full picture of what's happening. So who are we building for? Cities get credit toward their RHNA when a home is permitted, not built. So it's pretty far along in the planning process, but it's not complete yet. The RHNA covers 8 years. We're 3 years in. So that purple line you see is where we would expect cities to be now that we're about 38% of the way through the cycle. And you can see that we're really struggling here. These are the homes that have been permitted for acutely, extremely, and very low income residents. The RHNA category for these three categories is allocated together, and it's expected that the target is divided evenly between them. So just for example, some of the people that might fall into this income category are a cook, a home health aide, a child care worker, or a disabled or older adult living on a fixed income, a retail or grocery worker, or a beginning teacher. You can see that only one jurisdiction in the whole county is meeting or exceeding the progress we would expect them to make by this point in the cycle. As we acknowledged before, there are a lot of headwinds and challenges in our development environment right now. We hear frustration sometimes about how high the RHNA targets are. But our RHNA is a reflection of the housing need in our communities. It's not an arbitrary number. So we really are accountable for using every tool at our disposal with urgency to move this. One of the biggest barriers that we have is a shortfall of funding to support the development of deeply affordable homes. Santa Clara County's 2016 Affordable Housing Bond was tremendously successful and delivered even more homes than the county committed to. But those funds have now been successfully deployed, and we need to identify more funding to replace that. I also want to note that only the jurisdictions with the gold-colored bars are reporting all or most of their new homes as deed restricted. That's really important, and we'll dig into that a little more in just a minute. Here's our progress on homes for low-income families and individuals. So this might be an office manager, a construction worker, a firefighter. Again, very few jurisdictions are coming close to that purple bar where we would expect them to be at this point in the RHNA cycle. And only the jurisdictions with gold-colored bars are reporting all or most new homes as deed restricted. So let's talk about deed restrictions. A deed restriction is what keeps a home affordable to a resident of a certain income. Usually deed restrictions happen when there's some public subsidy of the home, or if a developer of market rate housing is required by the city where they're building to include a proportion of affordable homes through inclusionary housing. The California Department of Housing and Community Development allows cities to report a portion of some types of homes as very low income or low income, even if they don't have deed restrictions, if they have some kind of documentation to show why the rent would be at that level. Many of these are accessory dwelling units or ADUs, sometimes known as a granny cottage or an in-law unit. And cities in our region are using an outdated study that shows that rents for ADUs tend to be distributed among the income categories. So they can apply those same proportions to the ADUs built in the city, even if they don't actually know what the rents will be or if they will be rented at all. Relying on non-deed restricted housing for lower income residents is actually really dangerous because even if it's allowed, because there's no guarantee of lasting affordability. Okay, so here we are with moderate income homes. There are very few homes here that are deed restricted at the moderate income level, but we're starting to worry a lot less about deed restrictions at this point because people earning incomes in this range are generally really well equipped to compete in our rental market. It's still important to make sure we have enough homes for people in this range, but we can see that a few more of our jurisdictions are on track to meet their moderate income RHNA, or at least they're coming a lot closer. Why is that? So moderate income households, if you remember our chart of income categories, are earning between $162,000 and $246,000 for a family of four. So at 30% of their income, which is considered the basic standard measure of affordability, that's rent between $4,000 and $6,000 a month for a family of four. So that's about where our rental market sits. So this then is moving toward the kind of housing that the market wants to build without subsidy. And finally, here are the new homes affordable to people with above moderate incomes. These are also homes that the market generally wants to build. They don't require any public subsidy. They mostly just need land use and policies that don't create barriers to new development. We're seeing a majority of cities here getting a little closer to where we would expect them to be, but there's still a significant gap with some cities really struggling. So, what are cities working on to try to improve this progress? One of the most critical components of the housing element are the programs. These are a series of concrete, actionable commitments each city makes to meet the housing needs of its residents. I'm going to pass it over to Manuel Salazar, our planning and production associate, to talk about some highlights and trends on programs designed to produce more housing.
Great. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. Hi. So my section is going to be focusing on the production side of housing element implementation, specifically kind of what policies are determining where housing can go, and what it takes to actually make these feasible. So last year, if you joined us for our PIA, we spent a lot of time on the Grand Nexus study, which was, still underway. This year, though, we're kind of looking at a lot of the implementation of that study, what the study said, what was possible because of the study, and really having local jurisdictions take the data set, take the analysis, and draft real world policies through it. So next slide, please. Great. So, for those of you that don't remember, a quick refresher, the Grand Nexus was a collaborative effort among 6 Santa Clara County jurisdictions, rather than each city conducting work independently. These kinds of Nexus studies, or the Grand Nexus in this case, can be really expensive, and a lot of cities, especially smaller jurisdictions, can have a hard time paying for these. They're supposed to be updated on a somewhat frequent basis, and what they do is the the study is really intended to show feasibility, not just what cities could legally require, but what market could reasonably support. Importantly, this wasn't intended to create one countywide policy, but rather give each jurisdiction its own set of tools and justifications for what they could charge without being overburdensome to development. So it was one regional study. The nexus and the feasibility analysis was conducted over the last couple of years. And then really what's coming forward from this study are going to be 3 affordable housing tools, those being a commercial linkage fee, a residential impact fee, and an inclusionary housing ordinance. Uh, that said, not every jurisdiction partook in each one of these studies. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just do think it's important to note what cities were participating in them, that being Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Gilroy, I think it was Los Altos Hills, and Santa Clara. Next slide. Thank you. So yeah, like we were talking about, 3 kind of key policy recommendations came out from the study, or 3 possible recommendations. Those being a commercial linkage fee, residential impact fee, and inclusionary housing ordinance. Um, each city kind of fine-tuned and chose what they wanted to study, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But what are these different kind of programs, and what do they like provide? So commercial linkage fees kind of are a means of generating affordable housing funding from all new commercial developments. So essentially, if you want to build a business in a small, not in a small, but in the city, the idea is, businesses require employees, your employees require housing. So having these funds in order to fund housing for your employees is a means of cities providing that service through kind of capturing some of that capital that's provided. Residential impact fees kind of do the same thing, but on the residential side. So, when residential projects come in, they require like city service and other things. So, charging a fee for residential development is just one way to kind of, again, capture some of that equity that's being provided. Inclusionary housing is somewhat similar to a residential impact fee. It directly requires a share of new development to be affordable. Sometimes with alternatives such as an in lieu fee, where developers can fee out rather than just directly building the units. But this one is a little bit more, it requires what we're talking about today, which is a nexus study, essentially saying, hey, cities, if you're going to be implementing this, you can't set the fees at a level too high that it might inadvertently halt development. But you can also set it at a level that's, more reasonable so that you are capitalizing on all of this funding that could be coming through that can produce, some sort of social equity. So last year we were kind of talking about the study. This year we're talking about what cities are doing with it. Next slide. So yeah, here's kind of a breakdown of what each jurisdiction, what policies they are looking into, and kind of like the status as of their 2026 APR. So cities aren't necessarily taking all three policies forward. The study gave them options, and each is kind of focusing on its own priorities. Gilroy is looking at kind of the broadest package of everyone available. So it's a commercial linkage fee, a residential impact fee, and inclusionary housing ordinance. That said, that does not mean that each city is going to do everything that they said they were going to do, but rather they're going to study the feasibility, and then staff will provide recommendations for council to consider what is reasonably attainable in the current market, what might be a little difficult in the current market, but over the long, term of the life cycle or the rest of the housing element cycle, what could be, properly implemented, and so on. So that's kind of like what Gilroy thus far has been doing. Mountain View is kind of looking at commercial linkage fees and updating those to capture more potential funding for the city. But it's also looking into doing kind of BMR and inclusionary housing revisions. Last year, we saw that they actually made some revisions to the BMR program because, from my understanding, they're really trying to incentivize the on-site development of these units. And that's kind of what I wanted to notice. Some cities actually want the funds, some cities prefer to have the units built. And fine-tuning your inclusionary housing ordinance as well as the alternative compliances, such as your in lieu fee, is a wonderful way to do that. If you set fees really high, people are more incentivized to build the units. If you set the fees really low, people are more incentivized to give the city money, and then the city can administer the fees as they so, choose to do so. Uh, that said, Santa Clara residential impact fee and inclusionary housing ordinance, they're kind of looking to either do one or the other, maybe both. They kind of feasibly, financially make sense in the current market. Sunnyvale is kind of focused on more of fine-tuning its inclusionary housing, particularly their in lieu fee structure, potentially looking to see if they can charge different in lieu fees for different building types. This is also a wonderful tool because you can essentially utilize it to incentivize certain developments to move forward that you would like to see, whether it's like condos or higher density developments, and disincentivize what the city might not want to see. Lastly, Los Gatos is just looking into doing a commercial linkage fee. It was something they identified in their housing element as a means of potentially, procuring more funding for affordable housing projects. And it'll be interesting over the next couple of months to see, how much of this actually, moves forward. So, yeah, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily tie to the Grand Nexus, but somewhat similarly, this kind of goes into the other area of my work, which is land use and area planning. So if you look at the Grand Nexus as a means of, procuring funding for the development of affordable housing or having some sort of model that shows why, including new affordable housing stock in when like pardon me, if you look at the Grand Nexus as a means of kind of substantiating, the importance of building affordable housing, this is all about capacity. Land use and area planning is really about unlocking the ability for cities to plan ahead and choose where they want their housing to go, how dense it can be, and how many more units can be unlocked. And what we have been seeing is that a lot of cities across the county have utilized this specific housing element cycle as a means of doing some pretty massive changes. Palo Alto had their El Camino Real rezoning that happened back in May of last year. Over 500 new homes were enabled and unlocked across some like major transit corridors. Sunnyvale had their Village Center master plan, kind of having to create a mixture between, the need for neighborhood amenities and village centers along with housing capacity. Mountain View had their large undertaking of their R3's multifamily zoning update, which was years in the making, where they kind of did a reassessment of so many sites all across the city to see which of them could be upzoned to an R3 zoning district, which essentially was a lot of their like multifamily zoning. Milpitas, kind of quietly, but also to great effect, changed the zoning around their main street area to allow for higher density developments, seeing what works, kind of what typologies of different housing options would be, permissible and would really work in these jurisdictions. And I want to say they did a wonderful job as well. And then even more recently, Santa Clara adopted in May of 2026, so just about 2 months ago, updates to their El Camino Real specific plan, kind of showing that just because you do the work previously and you adopt a plan, there's always room for improvement. So, yeah. Next slide. Thank you. So we kind of talked about kind of what's been happening in land use and area planning, but I'd like to talk about what's coming up. So several major growth areas are now moving through planning and adoption with important opportunities for public engagement kind of on the horizon or having been engaged in the last couple of months. San Jose is probably the biggest of these, with three of their urban villages identified for adoption either in 2026 or in the sometime in the coming years. Five Wounds Urban Village, Saratoga Avenue Urban Village, and Eastside Alum Rock Urban Village. You may have seen the city actually do some outreach to residents and these community members and more broadly. And I really do encourage folks to, if these opportunities ever arise, go to the community meetings because, say you want to advocate for transportation, housing, community serving uses, whatever it might be. Getting engaged in these area plans is one of the best ways to see those desires for community benefits actually manifest. So Palo Alto, similarly, San Antonio Road Area Plan, they're still working on this. I've been engaged with them and their staff for the last couple of this point years working on this along with local advocates like Palo Alto Forward. And then Santa Clara has their Tasman East specific plan amendment, which should be coming sometime this year. So um, we'll see how that goes. And their station area plan, which I will always remain hopefully optimistic we'll move forward. So, yeah, next slide. Thank you. And other than just, area planning and the Grand Nexus, I will say there's been a lot of kind of broadband policy. I like to call this like the hodgepodge of the different housing policies. So they've really, a lot of jurisdictions across Santa Clara County have tried to see kind of like what works for our jurisdiction. What would we like to see? What kind of priorities? How do we unlock more housing capacity and build more units in a way that makes sense for our community? And three kind of big standout buckets tended to pop up every time I was looking at these policies, those being ADUs, affordable housing funding, and zoning and development reform. So for ADUs, a lot of the things that some jurisdictions can do if they really want to expedite and produce more ADUs is do some kind of more kind of just some more simplistic fine tuning to their local ordinances. Pre-approved plans are a wonderful thing. If people know that they can just plug into a process, they're more likely to do that. If your process is more, it involves a lot of regulatory compliance, it's really technically challenging. A lot of people can just be disincentivized from building ADUs altogether. Streamlined permitting, homeowner education, informational sessions, pamphlets, other materials that they can use helps a lot and affordability and production monitoring. ADUs inherently tend to be a more affordable housing option because they tend to be a smaller square footage and they're more accessible. But we do really encourage folks and all their jurisdictions to do their best to monitor the affordability of these units. Otherwise, we get bad faith actors that might be counting all their ADUs as something like very low or low income. So we really discourage that. Affordable housing funding is also a great way to kind of produce more units. Sunnyvale, I'll give them a shout out for being one of the only jurisdictions that still has a dedicated NOFA for affordable housing production. I think last cycle they put out something like $30 million, and it's just incredible to see those dollars being put to use because for every, like around $1 of commitment the city gives, they're getting, sometimes as much as 10 times back in terms of state and federal grants. So it's a really good way to unlock and leverage your funding. Along with local housing funds, doesn't have to be in a NOFA, uh, and also kind of applying for or helping developers in the state and regional grant applications. And lastly, other pro-housing policies getting adopted include things like in housing opportunity districts, where essentially you can kind of set a list of priorities for housing and what you can do there, and having developers be able to plug into these areas a lot simpler. Density bonus updates. Sometimes people have implemented local density bonuses that stack on top of the state density bonus. Setting objective standards, which is technically a state mandate, but I'm happy that some of the jurisdictions are, implementing it now. It's a better late than never. As well as kind of incentivizing smaller unit and missing middle kinds of housing. So yeah, with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Emily Ann Ramos, who will be talking about tenant protection-based policies.
Thank you, Manny. So Last year, when we looked at tenant protections in the housing element, we focused a lot on what cities actually committed to doing. So now we're close to 3 years into the housing element cycle, and so we can start asking a different question. How are those commitments turning into actual policies and programs? And so that's what we were looking for in the 2025 annual progress reports. And what we're finding is a mix, but a really interesting picture. There's meaningful progress happening across the county, but implementation is uneven, timelines matter, and something being listed as in progress doesn't necessarily tell us how close we are to actual policy. So this year, we wanted to take a look beyond whether tenant protections in the housing element, um, how they happen and what has happened since they got there. So the first thing that stood out was the different kinds of tenant protections are moving forward and at very different speeds. So next slide, please. Now, there's a lot of activity around tenant protections around the county, but the type of activity matters. We're seeing quite a bit of movement around tenant education, rental assistance, resource centers, legal services, community engagement, surveys, and policy studies. Now, those are very important. They connect tenants with the resources that can help prevent displacement, but some of the more structural or regulatory protections are moving more slowly. Things like expanded eviction protections, rent stabilization, right to counsel, and other policies that change the rules governing the landlord and tenant relationship are moving a little slower. Milpitas is a good illustration. Its APR reports that hundreds of households have received rental assistance. At the same time, that same APR says the city's evaluation of broader anti-displacement measures have, quote, not started yet. So one lesson from reading these APRs that are in progress is that it can mean very different things. A city can be doing a lot of good work while still not having started on another major housing element commitment. So as we move on to the next slide, when we start looking at when cities promise to do different things, another pattern emerges. So when we notice that some early on in the housing element timelines, the easier commitments or the things cities were already working on tend to show up earlier in the cycle. These might be outreach programs, studies, improvements to existing programs, or policies that were already moving toward adoption when the housing element was written. But some of the more complicated or potentially controversial policies have much longer timelines. For example, San Jose has a housing element commitment to considering expanding its just cause protections around occupancy limits, but that analysis and potential ordinance change isn't scheduled until 2027. I wouldn't say that this is universally true of every program in every city, but it's a pattern worth watching. That means that 3 years into the cycle, we haven't necessarily reached the hardest part yet. Some of the decisions the advocates fought to get on these housing elements may not come before councils until the second half of the cycle. So if you worked really hard to get a policy commitment into the housing element 3 years ago, this is not the time to stop watching it. So as we go on to the next slide, the good news is that cities also aren't necessarily trying to figure all this out by themselves. Um, so many cities have mentioned regional collaboration, particularly the Santa Clara County Planning Collaborative. We're seeing cities rely on the collaborative for research, data, community surveys, anti-displacement strategies, and learning from what other jurisdictions are doing. Gilroy, for example, participated in the county-wide displacement survey through this regional work. Santa Clara's work with the Planning Collaborative helped inform its broader anti-displacement policy review and council study session. And San Jose specifically said that participation in the collaborative helps staff learn about anti-displacement best practices from other communities. So that's encouraging. 15 cities don't necessarily need to independently research the same policy 15 different times. So regional collaboration can give cities data, policy models, and lessons from their neighbors. But there's an accountability piece here too. Participating in a regional process is a tool for implementation. It can't become a substitute for eventually taking local action. So in this next slide, we're going to take a look at places that we're seeing work actually translate into progress. So Cupertino gives us an example of an adopted policy. It created a priority and expedited process for tenants being displaced from expiring below market rate housing. It's basically a tenant preference. Palo Alto gives us a different kind of progress. Its rent registry is now operational. And that's important because the city now has a mechanism to collect information about things like notices to quit, unlawful detainers, evictions, and rent increases. The APR specifically identifies that data as something the city can use to establish trends and inform future policies to reduce displacement. Palo Alto also moved its fair chance housing proposal forward with staff receiving council direction in 2025. San Jose reports that more than 80% of the short-term activities in its rent stabilization program strategic plan has been completed. Gilroy has been building out its displacement prevention work through community engagement, regional collaboration, tenant resources, and the countywide displacement survey. So when a city is making progress, we're not saying that every housing element commitment is being accomplished. We're seeing different stages of implementation. So some cities have adopted policies, some are building infrastructure needed to implement or evaluate them. Some have policies moving through the legislative process, and some are doing community engagement and research that should eventually inform those decisions. The important thing is that whether that work continues moving toward the important thing is whether that work continues moving toward the commitment the city actually made. So that leads us to our next slide. Some housing element commitments are starting to slip. In Los Gatos, for example, a program with a June 2025 milestone was reported as not started yet. In Morgan Hill, work that was supposed to begin in 2025 had been moved to 2026. But I also want to be careful about how we interpret delays because APRs can tell us why something isn't happening in the schedule. So San Jose had some really interesting examples. Its soft story retrofit program anticipated a $25 million in federal funding. Now, changes to the FEMA BRIC program created significant uncertainty around that funding. So the city extended compliance deadlines and developed a smaller pilot program instead. And then there's another example also in San Jose around the tenant resource centers. Funding was expected to come through the Google Downtown West development. With that project on an indefinite hold, that funding has not materialized, and the city is looking instead at pop-up resource clinics. Those are very different situations from simply not starting something. So when we see a missed housing element milestone, I think advocates should ask these questions. Why did it happen? What changed? And what's new? What's the new plan? So accountability doesn't necessarily mean assuming bad faith. It means making sure that the commitment doesn't disappear when circumstances change. And there's another reason why we need to keep watching APR reports that something is continually moving forward. Sunnyvale does give us a good example, and we'll see that in the next slide. So in Sunnyvale's example is why we do need to keep on following each of these commitments. In 2023, Sunnyvale adopted the Tenant Protection and Relocation Assistance Ordinance, which provides 2 months of relocation assistance for qualifying no-fault evictions. Then in February 2025, Council considered increasing that assistance from 2 months to 3 months and directed staff to come back with an ordinance making that change. So when Sunnyvale prepared its 2025 APR, it reported that council had voted to increase that relocation assistance to 3 months and that staff would implement that change in 2026. Now, if we were only looking at the APR, we might reasonably think that this policy was essentially on its way to implementation, but the story didn't end there. Staff did what council directed them to do. They conducted additional outreach and brought an implementing ordinance back to council in May 2026. But when the ordinance came back, the council did not move forward with said increase of relocation assistance. So it's an important distinction when we're evaluating the housing element progress. The 2025 APR wasn't wrong. It just accurately reflected where the policy stood at that point in time. But council direction isn't the same as an adopted ordinance. So a study isn't the same as adoption. And even an ordinance coming back to council isn't a guarantee that it will ultimately become law. And that's why APR should not be treated as a snapshot. It should be treated as a snapshot, not as the end of the story. Housing elements give us commitments and timelines we can track. But advocates still need to follow through on those commitments through the entire policy-making process. And the next slide will bring me to what I think advocates should be looking over the rest of the cycle. So what do we do with all this? When you're looking at your city's annual progress report, don't stop whether a program says in progress. Go back to said housing element and look up, what did the city actually promise? When did they promise to do it? So, and then we look at what happened this year. If something was delayed, find out why. If circumstances changed, ask how the city is adapting. And then pay attention to where a policy is actually in the decision-making process. Has staff studied it? Has council given direction? Has an ordinance been drafted? Has it actually been adopted and implemented? Most importantly, figure out what comes next, because that's where the community engagement matters. One of the biggest takeaways 3 years into the cycle is that the housing element creates accountability, but it doesn't create inevitability. So getting tenant protections into the housing element puts them on the agenda and gives communities something concrete and to hold cities accountable to. But some of the hardest decisions are still ahead of us. So please keep tracking the commitments, keep watching the timelines, and show up when those decisions come back to your city. I'm going to throw it off to Allison.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the great presentation. And I think at some point we probably should have defined a little bit more clearly the annual progress reports are reports that the cities are required to make to the state every year. They're due by April 1st, and then the state kind of aggregates all of those and publishes them no later than end of June. So there's lots of information that are in the APRs and the annual progress reports, but there's also a lot that may not be. Emily, can you talk a little bit more about the ways that our team tracks what's happening with housing element programs in addition to just watching the APR?
Yeah, so the APR is really kind of a nice overview of everything, but because it's an overview of everything, it really doesn't get into a lot of specifics. So if you want to get the specifics, you have to probably reach out to either the housing staff of the city or your council members, or you could just white knuckle it and go through all the agendas that are happening in that year. There's also some cities publish something called like a tentative agenda list, where they let you know when there might be a future item of interest. Now, cities, they look over a lot of things, not just housing. So you would have to dig through a lot of that. But one of the easiest ways, if you have housing staff that are responsive to those kinds of requests, would be to reach out to the housing or planning staff of that city.
Thank you. And we're often involved in stakeholder meetings with city staff. We work hard to maintain relationships with city staff and elected officials. So we're tracking things in lots of different ways. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to drop more questions in here. So here's a question about whether or not SB at Home supports developments in state law that allow multi-unit developments in typical single-family neighborhoods. So these could be things like SB9 that allows lots to be subdivided and duplexes to be built. We also have local jurisdictions. San Jose right now is in the middle of its general plan 4-year review. They are really smartly getting ahead of the seventh housing element cycle, which we know is coming up sooner than we might think, to expand capacity by allowing what's called kind of a missing middle housing type in single family neighborhoods. So these might be a duplex, a triplex, a fourplex, small apartment buildings, the kinds of neighborhood scale homes that are present in some of some of our historical neighborhoods, some of our most treasured neighborhoods. So we have a question about where SV at Home falls on these, given that these homes may not be, they're not likely to be deed restricted, and they may not be affordable to people at the lower end of the income range. San Jose recently became one of the first cities in the state to allow the individual sale of ADUs. So an accessory dwelling unit. These are, because these share the land cost with the home that has whose property they're built on. The first ADU that sold in the city of San Jose sold for $530,000. That's still not going to be affordable to a low-income family, but that's a whole lot lower. It's less than half the cost, a median cost of a single-family home here in San Jose. So we believe that does fit a really important part of the housing spectrum that's not being addressed by the market in single-family neighborhoods because it's really not able to. Single-family neighborhoods have generally a single home on a single lot. It's the most expensive type of housing. Manny, I had a question for you. You talked a lot about area plans or specific plans, and we're seeing the city of San Jose as well as the cities that you covered looking at ways to kind of speed up this process and move some things forward. Can you talk a little bit more about how long the area planning or specific planning processes take from start to finish, and kind of what that means, how capacity translates into more homes?
Yeah, of course. So I think a great example of this actually is one of the upcoming area plans they're working on, which is the San Antonio Road area plan in Palo Alto. This has taken years. I mean, they identified this for context in the housing element that ended up being adopted. And if I'm not mistaken, was that 2023 was the adoption
Hmm.
of the county? Yes. So in 2023, they had already identified that. And I'm assuming years before that, they'd already identified the fact that, like, oh, this is be a potential site for development. We could do a lot of these areas, and this could be upgraded. So this is really a multi-year long process. It takes since 2023, I would say they started really doing some work on this, maybe in like late 2024, early 2025. And a lot of that was really preliminary work. They pull consultants to say how, the traffic's going to impact this area and what does, neighborhood activation look like and all of these different things. So a lot of times they do kind of like a needs assessment and figuring out what could actually be accessible on these sites. And then from there, they bring it to the community and say, here's our assessment of the potential and the capacity for these sites, but you as residents know the area best. So what would you recommend? How do you see this working out? So they do usually anywhere from 3, 4, 5, maybe community meetings where folks can weigh in, talk about what they like, what they dislike. And then once kind of like they've gotten that resident feedback, they then incorporate that with the analysis that they've done through the consultants, and will typically package that as some sort of policy recommendation for planning commission, and then later on council. And then council ultimately gets the deciding factor of like, do we want to adopt this, or if they feel better work could be done to unlock more units, they can give that. Sometimes staff will actually bring forward multiple recommendations and iterations of the plan. So it's a really involved process, I would say, which is something that's usually not as common for production-based policies, where a lot of it can be very technically nuanced, and a lot of it can be, around, oh, like how much would this cost on a per square foot basis versus this, and what if we removed like these requirements? So I really do encourage folks as much as possible to plug into, these area plans whenever possible, because a lot of the time they really are looking for community input. Theoretically, you could always just, like what's the maximum amount of density we can put in these areas? But community concerns and community feedback are really important for these elected officials. They want to know what the community wants. They want to know what the community needs. So I think it's kind of a balancing act between how do we unlock as much capacity and build for the residents of these communities and for the residents that want to live in these communities, but how do we do so in a way that's going to create more vibrant, sustainable, walkable communities? So I hope that answered your question.
Awesome, thank you. Emily, we have a question here about representation of lived expertise in the planning collaborative. So can you talk a little bit about how the planning collaborative functions and where lived expertise can play in and should play in to our program processes, our program implementation?
So, the planning collaborative is more of a tool, and it's a tool of providing the ability, and it's really more staff driven, city staff driven, where they would work together and then work with different policy experts and then share the policy expertise between the staff members of each of the city. When you think about lived experience, that is probably where the activism, direct activism from the people who have said lived experience need to be essentially in front of council, in front of staff. It would be outside of this separate tool of the planning collaborative. So when you think about ensuring that the views of those in lived experience um, get put into those policies, that's where the direct advocacy should go in, not necessarily in this tool or the planning collaborative. It's a great tool for staff, but that's not quite what it's used for. So that's probably where I would go with that.
I will say that that cities should be, while they're implementing policies, they should be engaging with the community to understand what the community needs. That actually is part of the housing element process when they're developing the programs, but it should continue throughout the implementation of the programs. They are actually accountable for doing this. So that's part of our role as advocates and your role as advocates is to continue to make sure that lived experience does play an important role in the development of programs, especially programs around preventing displacement, responding to homelessness. These are all things where staff hold certain types of expertise, but may not hold other types of expertise. So that's a fantastic question. I'm going to tie together two questions here. When will city staff start working on the next housing element? And do you think cities will be doing more in the next cycle to avoid being exposed to builders' remedy projects? Manny, if you want to take that one.
Sure. I think this housing element cycle, for better or worse, has been a lot of growing pains and a lot of lessons learned. Previous housing element cycles, I remember being an undergrad and we would examine these, and it was very much like, wouldn't it be nice if they actually did the stuff they were saying they were going to do in this? Or wouldn't it be nice if they actually implemented some more definitive and legally binding language? So I think what kind of happened here is a lot of things were going on. A pandemic happened while they were drafting all this. A lot of jurisdictions, this is their first time really taking it not as like a thought experiment, but actually an actual like policy tool that they can utilize in order to map out what their housing goals will be over the next couple of years. And because of that, it created a lot of uncertainty in the process. All the while, the state having people yell at them because they're not producing enough housing at the regional level or even at the state level, kind of was coming down a lot, like very hard on a lot of local jurisdictions. So it created a thing where the state was blaming a lot of local jurisdictions for not producing enough housing, and then local jurisdictions were kind of saying, we're doing our best to keep up. We have limited capacity, limited resources, and limited understanding of how this all functions. So everyone was kind of pointing and yelling at everyone, and it was creating a lot of confusion in the system. So that kind of opened the way to the state creating the builder's remedy and allowing, basically developers to build as much as they wanted, wherever they wanted, if you weren't in compliant of your housing element. Since then, I feel like a lot of the builder's remedy applications have either been able to work with the local jurisdictions to propose something that's maybe a little bit like more toned down or yada yada. So for the most part, a lot of these kinds of really bad projects, I'm talking the ones that were incredibly high density in areas they really shouldn't have been mostly, weeded out. And I don't foresee that happening as much in the next housing cycle because, for better or worse, what the builder's remedy is a massive stick that the state can bonk you on in order to make you hopefully comply. And it's not supposed to be a tool that's supposed to be finely calibrated to, fill the needs of every small city. It's more so supposed to be a disincentive. So I think a lot of the jurisdictions, because none of our cities in the county ended up having a compliant housing at one time. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case in the next cycle. I think a lot more cities are going to be doing the work sooner rather than later, so that once the time of submitting your applications does come around, they should be properly planned and ready to execute on those plans.
Thank you, Manny. I want to circle back because I'm seeing a comment in the Q&A. It seems like I was unclear. People with lived expertise, just to be very clear, do need to be at the table from the beginning of the process. So this includes when cities are creating the housing element, the programs in the housing element, when they are understanding what the community's needs are, city staff should be engaging with people with lived experience all the way through the process. So this includes the creation of the programs and also the implementation of the program. So when cities begin to work on a particular program, they should be, again, reaching out to stakeholders. That includes people with lived experience. So we absolutely agree that the expertise of city staff can be limited if they do not have lived expertise themselves. And they always need to incorporate lived expertise in the implementation of programs, especially programs that are designed to prevent displacement, respond to homelessness, and prevent homelessness. I hope I've cleared that one up a little bit. So we have come to the end of our time for Q&A, but I want to go back to what we need you to do. So our call to action today is to support new sources of funding. This is new sources of funding that we need not only to build new affordable homes and especially deeply affordable homes, but also for things like tenant protections, which can't be funded by some sources of money. So where we have bonds can help to fund the production and the preservation of housing. Bond money under the state's constitution can't be used for tenant protection. So we need to look at developing lots of different sources of funding. We're going to need your support for that. So here are some opportunities that we have right now. We have California's Proposition 1 that will be on your ballot in November, the Veteran and Housing Assistance Programs Bond Measure. I'm going to bump ahead here. We do urge you to vote yes on Prop 1. Proposition 1 would issue $11.25 billion in bonds, with $10 billion of that total dedicated to income qualified state housing programs. So like the multifamily housing program, the Cal Home program, the Joe Cerna Jr. Farm Worker Housing Grant Program, and $1.25 billion for the state veteran home loan program. So one thing I want to emphasize here is that the funding from this would flow into existing programs. It would recapitalize these existing programs that have run out of money. So these are programs that we know how to use. They're part of the state's what's called Super NOFA. So there's a single application that developments need to complete to have access to any of these sources of funding. So because the existing framework is there, we're able to deploy it quickly. This would bring money back into these tried and true programs we know work so they can continue to deliver new affordable homes for our communities. We do urge you to vote no on Proposition 43. So California communities have the right to make decisions at the ballot box about what local priorities we want to fund. Prop 43 weakens those rights by requiring a 2/3 supermajority to pass dedicated taxes placed on the ballot by voter petitions. This measure will block critically important investments in local priorities like affordable housing and homelessness solutions, as well as public schools, fire protection emergency services, even when voters propose those solutions ourselves. Finally, we want to let you know that we are actively involved in the work together with partners from a broad range of sectors across the region to develop a future regional measure that can bring in funds to help meet the housing needs of low-income families and individuals across the Bay Area. Both that future regional measure and potential county and local revenue measures, depending on how they are shaped, have the opportunity also to produce funds for tenant protections. So we want to make sure that we are keeping you informed. We've already provided one member update on the regional revenue measure process, yet another great benefit of being a member of SB at Home. If you're not a member already, we encourage you to join us. So thank you so much for joining us today for this Housing Element Progress Update. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for being part of a great conversation today.